Good morning, good evening, wherever you might be. This post is called "They Are Classics for a Reason." Socrates reasoned with analogies and was a critic of reasoning from first principles. He spent all of his time showing how reasoning from first principles leads to self-contradiction. Modern physics teaches you how to reason from first principles, but by thinking in this way, one eventually ends up in a devil's circle with a sophistic, solipsistic, Einsteinian conflation and confabulation of basic definitions of space, time, mass, and speed. Without awareness of its own non-recursive limitations, physics can get very stupid very quickly. For example, when the language used by astronomers is inconsistent with the language used by accelerator physicists, they stupidly insist that this is a great mystery which requires further investment to resolve, while the truth is that there is no mystery other than why two groups of people can fail to notice that they are defining space and time in different ways. Even back in 300 BC, Socrates had an understanding of the first principle of physics. Today, we might call it the convection principle. Nature hates a vacuum, or nature hates a change in flux. But after all of Socrates' examples of how this first principle leads to self-contradiction when you look at a system simultaneously from within and without, it becomes obvious that there can be no single theory which simultaneously describes both the part and the whole. A discipline which only has this single first principle will inevitably lead to self-contradiction. One of the classic descriptions of this problem was encapsulated in Plato's cave allegory, a concept which inspired me to write the following poem while I was floating in a swimming pool in Greece. Clouds, ghostly muses born of Zeus's lightning, are thoughts condensing in our minds? Precipitated by Apollo's light, these immortals cast shadows that determine their future forms. In Plato's cave we fear such shadows of ourselves, knowing their power to bewilder and ensnare. By Prometheus's firelight we tell stories, ghost stories, to remind ourselves of things that can't be said. I think this was what Socrates was trying to teach, up until they executed him. Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth and making the worse argument appear to be the better. The irony of this accusation is that only a few years earlier, the comedic playwright Aristophanes had satirized Socrates' work by characterizing it as sophistry, the practice of making the worse argument appear to be the better. But this was the antithesis of what Socrates was trying to teach. The extent to which this satire led to Socrates' execution is not clear, but it surely didn't help. Aristophanes' play The Clouds depicted Socrates as a man who taught young people how to sit around, get flabby, and make confusing legal arguments to get out of paying debts. Was this an early version of modern monetary policy? In opposition to this sophistic character stood philosophy with a capital P. Philosophy stood for the virtues of the past: obedience, physical fitness, modesty, and plain speech. I picture him as a sort of tribal warrior ideal, as in the music here. Yeah, you get the picture. Tough guys. But this contrast between sophistry and philosophy presented a false dichotomy, because philosophical ideals we hold up as emblematic of the way things were are fantasy. Things weren't perfect in the good old days, any more than they are all bad today. If anything, the enemy of good reason is reasoning from a single first principle, which is what all physical and philosophical theories do. One must look at an issue from at least two sides to understand it, and this was at the heart of what Socrates taught. It was also what Aristophanes tried to teach when he wrote The Wasps, a play which completely inverted the message of his earlier work, The Clouds. Unfortunately, people were generally too stupid to understand the subtleties of Socrates and Aristophanes' messages, and this contributed to Socrates' death sentence. Socrates' prosecutor was allowed to propose a sentence. He chose death. Socrates was allowed to propose a sentence. He suggested free meals in the town hall for life. The jury needed to decide between the two punishments. They chose death. Socrates was not happy about having to die, but he would rather die than grovel or apologize for his life's work. There were some extenuating political circumstances surrounding his trial, which didn't come through clearly within Plato's account. During Socrates' life, Athens had its democratic government temporarily replaced with a group of 30 murderous oligarchs, whom Socrates supported, even though he encouraged them to be less murderous. When democracy was restored, Socrates was a symbol of anti-democratic sentiment, and he was killed because of that. The fact that he had spent his life pointing out the ways in which people were stupid didn't help matters. He was officially convicted for corrupting the youth and not supporting the gods of the city. If democracy was not an ideal of the city, which was loved by the city's gods, he was certainly guilty of not supporting it. Given the current state of democracy in the world, I wonder how such stories can guide us. When people are afraid, they democratically elect demagogues, who hold on to power by oppressing or murdering minorities. In those instances, is it appropriate to support a non-democratic coup in order to protect the minorities? I think World War II taught us the answer to that question. I'm led to the conclusion that a traumatized, fearful population might not make the best democratic choices, and that fear caused by globalization will take some time to work through, as the pendulum swings both ways to appease people of all persuasions. I think that Socrates understood this principle when he saw Athens' political system break down, and that was why he supported the temporary reign of the murderous oligarchs. Perhaps he thought that it doesn't make sense to fight too hard against what is, because the winds of change will blow things back to where they want to be. Socrates could no more direct those winds than anyone else. He could only see the direction in which they were blowing, and that is a dangerous position to be in, because people have a tendency to shoot the messenger. This was composed from some posts I made on Quora, and I'm sharing it here because I want to give people maps to the books that helped me develop a broader sense of the world. Any curious person can follow the keywords and do the same. For a more whimsical sort of knowledge map, I encourage you to take a look at my novels. They are a lot more fun than my nonfiction, and they are safe for kids, but deep enough for adults. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.